now we're going to talk a little bit about tone. Now, not only did Eddie's guitar playing completely change rock guitar in 1978, so did his tone. Guitar players had never heard a guitar sound like that before, and it really can be seen as the sort of original high gain sound. It really is that, you know, chewy. It's the brown sound. It's chewy. It's got low mid to it. It's got thickness, but it's got that bright upper frequencies giving it that sort of sparkle and that sheen. His sound was absolutely incredible. Now, I kind of divide his tone up into sort of 3 or 4 eras. We have that early era where he was using British style amplifiers, absolutely cranked. His Frankenstein guitar, and he'd utilise flangers, phasers and echo. He'd have an old tape echo which he would plug into the front of the amplifier and use that to drive the preamp, or use that to drive the preamp valves to get even more crunch out of the amp. And he'd also use the variac to change the voltage to enable him to run the amp hotter. He would also use the echo as well. He'd adjust the speed of the echo, so the pitch, he'd turn the repeats up, so you just get this constant repeating phrase, and then he'd turn the delay time to drop the pitch of the notes. And he'd have the echo unit mounted in an old World War II bomb. So yeah, it was a real showman when it came to how he performed. You see him, you know, holding a note and then turning adjusting the delay. But then we have the 80s sound where he was still using the sort of single pickup style Frankenstein guitars, although those changed as we get into the mid and the late 80s, and he was still using British amps, although he started experimenting more with more sort of flexible modern American style amplifiers. But he'd run a wet, dry, wet setup, which basically meant the middle speaker cabinet and the head was completely dry, and then he'd send a signal from the amp into his time-based effects. He'd use a harmonizer, and he'd have different pitches on each side that gave him this thick, wide modulation, as well as using different delay times in each side. And then that would be fed into a power amp and then into a pair of speaker cabinets. So he'd get a real separation with his tone, you know, dry cabinet in the middle and then all the effects on the outside. And by the early 90s, Eddie was then into having his own signature gear. He was using 2 pickup guitars, which was unheard of. You know, on his original Frankenstein guitar, he had the pickup in the neck, but it didn't work. And the pickup selector, because he didn't know how to wire it, he just screwed it inside the hole of where the middle pickup would go. But in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, he started using guitars he designed that had 2 pickups, and there he was using his own signature amps, which were a lot more controllable. So the sound changed again. He had more gain, so the sound was heavier. And so for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge album and The Balance, we see a lot more of a modern sound, a lot more pronounced pitch shifting for that sort of chorus effect. And then later on we see him kind of go back to that older sound. He's using a wah-wah a lot there as a tone control. He had a real upper mid-range bite, still doing the wet, dry, wet rig, but the chorusing wasn't as pronounced. It was a little bit of a hark back to his older tone. So how do you produce an Eddie Van Halen style tone? Well, I'm holding this guitar with a whammy bar on it. You don't have to play a whammy bar guitar at all. Just a guitar with a humbucker is preferable. Any guitar will work. You know, you'll be able to get a Van Halen tone of sorts. And Eddie used single coil pickups, he used P90 pickups, but that classic tone is based around a humbucker in the bridge. Now, when it comes to amps, he'd round his amps, everything on flat out, and then back it off a little bit. You know, he said it was like running a Formula One race car. He'd be cranking it to the max and just pulling it back a little bit so that it didn't blow. Thankfully, though, with modern amplifiers, it's possible for us to get higher gain tones at lower volume and a lot more controlled. Now, you want to dial in some mid-range, you want to try and get a pronounced top end in your sound, but try not to have too much gain. His sound was pretty clean, even though it was a hard rock tone. Okay, so let's start off by building our tone. I've got a driven sound on the amplifier. Kind of going for that sort of thicker low end, but with a little bit of pronounced top end to it. Not too much distortion. I might use a boost pedal as well. I like using a clean boost. And the clean boost is a great way of sort of emulating how Eddie would drive the front of these amps a little bit harder with the preamp of the echo unit. And the reason why I like to use a boost is because when you're playing rhythm, you don't want it quite as... You want to retain some of that thickness. You don't want it too saturated. But then when we go, you know, we want to kick in the boost and get a little bit more saturation. Now, another important effect when it comes to piecing the puzzles together to creating a Van Halen tone is echo. Now, echo is, as it sounds, it's a repeat. A delay will work absolutely fine. Like I said, later on, Eddie was using delays, but that early tone, he had a very short echo. And the difference between echo and delay is that echo has a little bit of a less hi-fi sound about it. It's a little bit darker, a little bit old school. Let's have a listen. You can hear there that I've got a very short, tight echo to the sound. And it just thickens up the sound ever so slightly. Another effect that you hear Eddie Van Halen using is the flanger, and that's quite an exaggerated modulation effect, and you'll hear that on such tracks as Unchained. Let's have a listen to a little bit of a riff now without the flanger, and then I'll kick the flanger in. So here it is without. Okay, let's bring the flanger in. You can hear that it really adds, again, a thickness and that signature modulation to his sound. Now, another effect that Eddie would use is the phaser, and that's a little bit more of a subtle modulation effect with like a slower sweep to it. And you'd hear him use that a lot on his lead tones as well as his rhythm tones, but you can really hear it on Eruption. What I'm going to do is just play a riff without the phaser, and then we'll kick it in. Here we go. Now with the phaser. We can use combinations of the effects as well. If I add in the echo, have a listen to the echo and the phaser when I play that riff. He'd also do these cool things where he'd rub his palm on the strings with the echo and the phasing effect. You know, I just love the sound effects that he would create. Now, we can have a little bit of fun and combine some effects. Just to give you an example, I'm going to use the booster just to push the amp a little bit harder, and I'm going to use the phaser and the echo, and have a listen to how that sounds. You start to get that sort of sound that we associate with Eddie Van Halen's playing. So if you're aiming for a Van Halen style tone, you want to have a reasonable amount of gain, maybe push it a little bit harder for your solos, and try experimenting with some modulation, namely flangers and phaser, as well as some echo. Another thing that he did in the studio was that he would use a chamber reverb, and he would add that onto one side. So if you're using some kind of multi-effects unit, try adding a plate reverb, and that will really help with the tone as well.